Okay, thanks everybody for joining me today. I'm Emily McGlynn. I am a PhD candidate at UC Davis in the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department. My research focuses on the economics of climate change, and in particular on how we can efficiently utilize agricultural and forest land to help mitigate climate change or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. I'm going to talk a little bit about my particular research question for today, which is what are the costs of avoiding greenhouse gas emissions on agricultural land, particularly under short-term voluntary conservation incentive programs? I'm going to talk about why I think this is an interesting and important question. So let's think about this in the context of kind of the core of the economics of climate change, where traditional theory tells us that the most efficient approach to mitigating climate change would be to implement an economy-wide compulsory price on any unit of greenhouse gas emissions equal to the discounted future net damages of that marginal unit of greenhouse gases. So very traditional Pigouvian tax setting. The challenge is in the land sector, things are a little more complicated. So land use change, and forestry activities are projected to be the third largest source of potential greenhouse gas reductions by 2030 in the United States, after the power and transportation sectors. So really big potential contributors to greenhouse gas reductions over time. But it's not going to be politically or even logistically feasible to implement a binding carbon price across 77 million American landowners. So instead, US policy in the land sector has focused on voluntary and increasingly short-term conservation incentives in an effort to promote greenhouse gas avoiding practices on agricultural and forest land. So folks might be familiar with some of these programs, things like the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, the Conservation Reserve Program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program. These are voluntary incentive programs supported by the USDA, US Department of Agriculture, that Biden administration has proposed bulking up their budgets by billions of dollars annually in an effort to meet our 2030 greenhouse gas reduction targets. The real challenge here for my research is that studies that look at the greenhouse gas mitigation potential, you're welcome to come in if you're in the right room.
No, don't worry. I might be in the room.
Okay. Studies that are looking at the greenhouse gas mitigation potential of US agriculture and forestry are not reflecting this policy reality. So out of 26 studies and 142 scenarios that I assessed, published since 2000, these are studies that estimated the greenhouse gas mitigation potential in the United States of agricultural and forest lands. Virtually every scenario assessed in this literature assumes a universal compulsory carbon price can be applied in the land sector, and no scenarios assessed the potential for how short-term or voluntary programs would perform in this type of setting. So this figure down here is a summary of this meta-analysis I did for this Holtman et al. Paper last year. Every dot represents a different scenario of how much greenhouse gases could be reduced by the land sector in the United States. On the x-axis, on the y-axis, we have the equivalent carbon price, or how much it will cost to deliver that amount of greenhouse gas reduction. And we can see there's only one scenario in this entire literature that assumed that it was voluntary to participate in this carbon incentive program. And that scenario was by far the most costly one for delivering greenhouse gas reductions in the land sector. And this makes sense because if people have the flexibility to choose whether or not they can receive this incentive to store more carbon on their landscape or change their practices, we're not going to get everybody under that umbrella like we will when we assume a universal compulsory carbon incentive program. And there's a couple of reasons why this literature has these limitations. It's because we are primarily using partial and general equilibrium models that capture a lot of different markets. And so they have to cut corners in other ways to make them tractable. So first of all, they're all spatially aggregated. So they operate over entire regions. And so you're not able to capture potential heterogeneous landowner choices to participate or not in these programs. And they're also deterministic. So they're not accounting for any volatility in agricultural markets, or as I'll talk about today, real estate markets, this volatility being a really important driver of landowner behavior in making choices about land use and land management over time. So that option value, encouraging landowners to wait before they commit to a given incentive, participation in a given incentive program until they have more information about how the future evolves.
Emma,
Yeah.
I think if you hit that double arrow button in the top left of the screen, or the top right if you're looking at it there,
Oh,
yeah, that might
yes.
take you to presentation.
It's at least full screen now. I'm not totally, I'm not totally sure why I have to scroll rather.
Well,
I'll figure that one out. Okay. So what I'm going to try to contribute to this literature gap is I'm going to bring a spatially explicit dynamic programming approach to a literature that is in general dominated by these partial and general equilibrium models. And that's going to address both the ability to represent individual landowner choices over time to participate in a voluntary program. And it's allowing me to represent important sources of volatility and uncertainty in driving landowner decision-making in this setting. And I'm going to focus on this question in particular in Santa Clara County, California, where I've been working with county planners to understand how voluntary conservation programs can help them preserve agricultural land and reduce greenhouse gas emissions attributable to urban sprawl. I argue that the modeling approach I'm taking here can be scaled up and broadened to national agricultural and forest climate policy questions in a really useful way. In particular, my initial results suggest that these kinds of short-term voluntary conservation programs could avoid agricultural land conversion and reduce greenhouse gases at roughly a price of $160 to $230 per ton in 2030. And so that's pretty expensive compared to the carbon prices assumed in these compulsory economy-wide climate policy studies, just giving us an initial sense that when we account for the voluntary nature of these programs, we have to account for the fact that likely these mitigation options are going to be more costly. So just a little bit about my setting, Santa Clara County. It is the home to Silicon Valley. It is just south of the San Francisco Bay. It is known as the Valley of Heart's Delight. So historically, it's been a really active agricultural region. And of course, in the past several decades, we've had this explosion of economic growth in Silicon Valley and the San Jose area, and increasing urban sprawl from that region over time, increasing development pressure throughout the county. We also have this really productive agricultural land in the valley here in the south in Santa Clara County. And then up into the hills on either side of that valley, we have a lot of open range land used for grazing. So the county planners in Santa Clara really want to understand how to balance the agricultural character of the county, maintaining a sense of place, managing urban sprawl out of Silicon Valley. And they also want to understand how to manage a particularly dispersed conversion of agricultural land. So accounting for the fact that if urban development is happening sporadically throughout the county, it can increase costs of agricultural operations around these developed areas, because your neighbors might start complaining about noises and smells. It can create more traffic. And so creating costs for the remaining agricultural operations that are there. So I'm going to talk about how, in my approach, I'm able to account for some of those spatial spillover effects for localized and sporadic urban development throughout the county. So in Santa Clara County, and like most other parts of the United States, there are several agricultural conservation programs that already exist. So they have purchase of agricultural conservation easements, otherwise known as purchase of development rights. These are common programs throughout the United States, where essentially a land trust will purchase the full developed land value of an agricultural parcel in exchange for a commitment to maintain that parcel in some agricultural use. California also has what's called the Williamson Act, which is just California's current use property tax law, where landowners can enroll in the Williamson Act, and they will receive a property tax aligned with the agricultural use of their property in exchange for a rolling 10-year commitment to staying agricultural as opposed to developing their land. So in my particular setting, what I'm going to talk about today is I want to understand how a short-term conservation program, in addition to some of these existing programs, how much can it have an effect on the future of urban land development in Santa Clara County? I want to understand a business as usual case of how much agricultural land is actually at risk of development over the next 30 years. I'm going to develop a number of policy cases to understand how much of that business as usual development is avoidable under a variety of contract lengths and incentive levels. And I want to understand from the county planner's perspective, if they have a given budget for what they're able to spend on this program, which program design is going to be most cost effective for them, delivering the most avoided urban development at the least cost. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit more structurally about what we think is going on here at the individual landowner level, and hopefully clarify what we mean about what's a conservation program, what are landowners committing to. Before I move on to that, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, can you clarify for me exactly how the land conversion, what gases are released, and you know what is its contribution to the stock of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there's a number of different channels for how converting a piece of agricultural land to urban development can result in increased greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. So first of all, upon being converted, converting an agricultural parcel to some residential or commercial use, you have the potential of losing biomass. You could lose trees, you can lose topsoil, and that's going to release any stored carbon in that biomass or in that soil into the atmosphere as CO2. So that's an immediate release of greenhouse gases. Then we have to account for the fact that the land use on that parcel has changed. So we have some incremental amount of greenhouse gas emissions attributable to the vehicle miles traveled of anyone who's now living on that parcel, marginal increases in the use of electricity, natural gas on site. So all of these things are also contributing. That's the kind of urban sprawl component of the greenhouse gas emissions. So for both of those reasons, the county planners and policymakers in California more generally are really interested in managing and conserving agricultural land to constrain that urban sprawl. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the landowner choice of whether or not to sell their parcel to a developer in a setting without any sort of conservation policy. So we can really think about this as a simple optimal stopping problem. So this is the problem facing an individual agricultural landowner. They want to maximize their returns to operating on this parcel with respect to the optimal time T to stop receiving some constant agricultural profit received in every time step, and to sell their parcel in that optimal time T to a developer. We're assuming that there is some third-party developer who in every time step is making an offer to this landowner, and that offer the developer is making, it follows some stochastic process over time. So the landowner has some idea about the volatility and the trend in that offer, but they don't know exactly what the developer is going to offer in any future time step. So as long as our developer offer stochastic process follows some, some well-behaved characteristics, the solution to this optimal stopping problem is going to be characterized by some optimal P star, where if the developer's offer is above P star, then the landowner will sell. The landowner doesn't know when exactly that P star is going to occur, but the solution will be characterized by some expectation for what T star will be. So just to visualize that a little bit, we have our let's say over the next 40 years, we can expect to have some constant agricultural profit happening down here. And let's say we have this particular realization of the developer offers over time. Obviously, for the landowner, the exact realization is going to be uncertain for any future time step. For this particular stochastic process, our P star occurs at this level, and as soon as the developer offer hits that P star, the landowner will sell. And let's just imagine that our expected T star was in 2050. We ended up actually selling a little bit later than that, but that's okay. Now let's introduce a conservation program to this setting. Now, because it's a voluntary program, the landowner has a choice of whether to do what they were doing originally. They can either not participate in the conservation program, and in that case, their problem is the same as the original problem I just explained. So that's program F1 here. Or they could choose program F2, which is a similar problem, except we're going to assume that in exchange for participating in the program, the landowner receives an incremental incentive on top of their agricultural profit that they receive in every time step. So that's their conservation incentive, C. However, now their optimal time to sell to the developer is constrained such that their optimal T star cannot occur before their conservation contract expires. So they're committing to a certain amount of time, I'm calling it capital J, to keep their land in agricultural use, and they can't sell to the developer before capital J. As long as T star is after capital J, then they can either keep receiving their agricultural profit. Since the contract has expired, we now don't have the additional incentive anymore, but now they can sell to the developer. So what does that look like visually? So if the landowner chooses the conservation to participate in the conservation program, our agricultural profit moves up from down here to up here. That's our agricultural profit plus C. And that has the effect of reducing the cost of waiting to sell your land to the developer. That's going to push our expected time to, it's going to increase our optimal P star. I'm calling it now P double star is going to increase because we've decreased the cost to waiting to sell to the developer. Because we have a higher P star, that's going to increase our expected time to selling the parcel. And that's what I'm calling the subsidy effect. Purely by increasing the returns to agriculture, we are delaying the landowner's choice to sell their parcel to a developer. But what's also happening is that the landowner now is completely constrained from selling to the developer before their contract is over. And because the developer offer is a stochastic process, we could have a situation where the offer has some unexpected price shock that results in us being higher than P double star. But because the landowner is constrained from selling to the developer during the contract, we're shielding that parcel from being developed from those unexpectedly large price shocks. So that's what I'm calling the shield effect. So we have these two effects in operation in reducing the probability of development in any given time step as a result of this voluntary conservation program. And in fact, these two effects, the subsidy effect and the shield effect, are linked. So because for a higher conservation incentive, C, we're going to further extend the waiting time. That's going to increase our expected T double star. So our T double star is getting longer in probability as C increases. That is going to make a difference in how willing the landowner is to enroll in the conservation program. But the landowner is also going to want to know that it's sufficiently unlikely that their optimal time to develop will be during the contract length. Because if it's really likely their optimal time to sell is during the contract length, that's not going to be optimal for them to enroll in the conservation program. So we have these two effects linked through as long as T double star as a function of the conservation incentive is sufficiently larger than J, the landowner is likely to enroll. What we want to understand through a numerical analysis that I'll go to next, what's the magnitude of these two effects in conserving agricultural land for a given conservation incentive and a given contract. So now I'm going to move on to talking about my numerical methods for setting up a model to look at these questions in the Santa Clara context in particular. And to do that, I am going to use two models. I am going to develop a parcel price prediction model, and I'm going to use that as an input to a Markov decision process model. And I'm going to describe these two models in detail next. So this first model, the parcel price model, what I want to do is approximate this stochastic process of future developer offers, what we call PT in the simplified examples earlier. We want to develop that developer offer for every developable agricultural parcel in Santa Clara County, consistent with the observed historical volatility of those developer offers and the characteristics of each agricultural parcel. To do this, I'm going to use 40 years of core logic data on real estate transactions in Santa Clara County for agricultural land in particular. And I'm also going to be able to use information about agricultural parcels in Santa Clara that have never been transacted over the past 40 years. So both of those pieces of information are going to be important. So to develop this parcel price model, I'm going to utilize an analytical framework provided by Fisher, Geltner, and Polakowski in 2007. So they were looking at real estate market more broadly, but it's a good setting for agricultural land as well. What we have here is we have a population of buyers and a population of sellers. So the buyers here are going to be the developers interested in purchasing agricultural land, and the sellers will be the agricultural parcel owners. And these two populations each have their own distribution of reserve prices for what they're willing to pay for a piece of agricultural land and what they're willing to accept for selling their land. So each population has some mean reserve price for a parcel with a given set of characteristics in a given point in time. And around that mean, we have a distribution representing the heterogeneity of individuals in this buyer and seller market. What's happening though is that we're only observing transactions in this market where the individual buyer reserve price is higher than the individual seller reserve price. That's the only region in this market where transactions are possible. So if we were to just take a straight OLS regression of observed transactions in this market on characteristics of parcels and maybe some time dummies, our parameters are likely to be biased because the expected error in this region may not be 0, because we're only observing a limited region of these two distributions of our population reserve prices. So this ends up being a good use for a sample selection model, very standard kind of Heckman approach to controlling for the likelihood that any given transaction was observed in the marketplace, controlling for the distribution of buyer and seller reserve prices. So we have our latent variable here being the difference between the buyer reserve price and the seller reserve price. What we observe in reality is a 1 if this latent variable is greater than 0, and we don't observe the transaction if our latent variable is less than 0. Once we control for this unobserved latent variable through a first stage probit model, then we can include our standard inverse Mills ratio in our linear model to now control for potential bias of transactions that we observe not being fully representative of all the possible stakeholders in the marketplace. Now, what the Fisher model does that's really useful is that they were actually able to utilize the parameters that we get from both the probit stage and the linear model stage of this sample selection model. We can actually recover the parameters just for the buyers in this marketplace. And that's what we're really interested in, because we want to develop this projection of what the developers in the marketplace are likely to offer landowners over time. What that ends up doing in reality is it is capturing how developer offers have evolved over time in the past, holding constant supplier reactions to any evolutions that are happening in the land market. So we're holding the supply side dynamics constant and focusing only on the dynamics on the demand side. And in particular, we're going to keep these parameters from the demand side market, from the demand side reserve price model to make our price projections going forward. In particular, we're going to do something special with these beta variables, these beta parameters. Betas are coefficients on annual time dummies. And with very small amount of manipulation, we can convert these time dummy coefficients into values that represent a county-wide average for the developer or the buyer price per unit of parcel quality. And the parcel quality is measured by our variables that we're using to the hedonic variables that we're using to control for the value of a given parcel. So in this setting, our hedonic variables are things like the size of the parcel, the soil quality, the agricultural productivity, distance to amenities like city centers and nearest roads, slope of the parcel. So we can talk more about the role of the and which hedonic variables are used in my model. But once we control for all those variables, we're left with this residual beta, which we can consider these county-wide average prices for a unit of parcel quality.
Emily?
Yes.
Can I ask about the objective here is, as you stated, to focus on the demand side, which
Yes.
sounds like that's being thought of as developers rather than other farmers who might buy from a farmer to continue farming. So the focus is on developers. And then in the list of parcel criteria, parcel characteristics, you included something like soil quality,
Yes,
would we, my prior would be that a developer wouldn't really care as long as the soil isn't problematic for development. So that soil quality would seem to be more of a variable you might expect on the supply side rather than the demand side.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about kind of separating those two things? Or are you thinking about not separating those things?
that's a really, really good question. So a challenge in this model is that I don't observe after a transaction occurs for a given agricultural parcel, whether or not it was ultimately developed, or if it was, how long it took for that parcel to be developed. So I'm not yet able to control for which of these transactions actually represent a developer transaction versus a farmer to farmer transaction. I'm making a simplification that because of the intense urbanization pressure in this county, those capitalized land rents from the developed use are dominating the transaction value in all of these, dominating the value of the offer in any of these transactions. That's a simplification I'm not totally happy with, and I'm also looking at bringing in some data on a smaller subset of the county, looking at parcels that we know for sure were developed after the transaction. So I'm thinking about ways to exploit that data set, and I have not yet done that, but it's a great question. So there are some simplifying assumptions built in here.
So do you find that something like those agricultural variables like soil quality are significant or not significant?
That's a good question. I have to go back and look at the at that particular parameter. If I'm recalling, I don't recall it being significant, so I'm using a variable that the state of California has a farmland productivity index, and I'm taking that value. I don't recall that parameter being significant, which would be an indicator that that's not a large driver of offers in this marketplace. But I should verify that. I can let you know. Okay. So now we have our, we take our time dummy coefficients, the beta variables, and we've converted them into, with very minor manipulation, this buyer unit price for a single unit of parcel quality. And I'm going to fit those observations to those coefficients to an autoregressive order 1 model in order to be able to forecast future developer offers for every parcel. So this autoregressive model is going to be common to all agricultural parcels in the county. The only thing that's differentiating offers for different parcels is going to be their hedonic variables. And in this AR1 model, I'm also accounting for historical county population, county personal income, and historical changes in construction costs over time. So as I said, the AR1 model is useful. Here we have our historical observations of the price for a unit of parcel quality. We can see it's pretty volatile. And then we can use that AR1 model to make predictions about the distribution of possible developer offers over time. This Monte Carlo simulation is going to be really important for calculating the transition probabilities of arriving at any given countywide average parcel quality price over time. That's going to be a really important input to the next model that I'm going to talk about, the Markov decision process model. So just to wrap up my price model, at the end of the day, for any future time step and for every agricultural parcel in the county, I can estimate the offer that they are going to get from a developer, both as a result of the buyer's coefficients on the hedonic variables for that parcel, and a common county index value that is experienced by all parcels in common. And then we have this, okay, yeah, this error here should be the independent parcel shock. So we have two sources of stochasticity in this price model. We have both an independent parcel shock that's going to be independent across all parcels and for all time steps. And then all parcels are also experiencing a common temporal shock that's entering from the autoregressive model. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the Markov decision process model, unless anybody has any questions about the price model.
So the assumption is that landowners have expectations about future prices that are given by your estimated model.
That's right.
Where you've leveraged lots of specific data for that, but that's a reasonable model of what landowners are likely to expect given their knowledge of local markets.
Right, it's going to be a prediction of future offers from developers consistent with historical volatility and consistent with trends, particular in the relationship between developer offers and these other economic variables, population, personal income, construction costs. So in this particular Monte Carlo output, I'm assuming constant, I'm assuming in the future we'll have the constant rate of growth in population and economic growth and construction costs that we've seen historically. So we can imagine it's going to be really important to do some sensitivity analysis around how those economic variables change over time, because those are going to have a big influence on how we predict future developer offers. Now that we have our price predictions, we can use that as an input to this Markov decision process model. Basically, all I'm trying to do is for every agricultural parcel in Santa Clara County, identify their optimal set of actions over time in maintaining agricultural use, choosing to participate in the conservation program, and ultimately when to sell their parcel to a developer. And that's all this Bellman equation is representing. The one wrinkle that I'm introducing to this problem is that, as I mentioned, the county planners are very concerned about these potential spillover effects of developed use on surrounding remaining agricultural operations. So what I want to be able to reflect is the fact that neighboring development status can impact your own parcel's returns to agriculture. So that means I have to solve this MDP model simultaneously across all parcels. And I'll talk about how I end up doing that. That's what this means, that every other parcel's optimal, every other parcel's optimal choice, every other parcel's, sorry. Okay, every other parcel besides parcel I is choosing their optimal choice. So that's what we need to solve for in this model. So just to describe the MDP model in a little more detail, our state space is defined by the time step that you're in. We're operating from 2020 to 2050 in this model. We also need to keep track of whether or not your parcel is enrolled in the conservation program, and if so, what time step in the contract. So from not enrolled being 0 to the final year of the contract being capital J. And then we also need to keep track of the evolution in the developer offer to the parcel. So we need to keep track of where we are in the county index transition probability space. And we also need to keep track of our individual parcel shock. Over time, there's only 3 actions that the landowner can take. They can stay in agriculture. While they're in agriculture, they can choose to enroll in the conservation program. And then they can also choose when to develop. At that point, they're out of the game. The rewards to each of those actions for agriculture, they maintain a constant agricultural profit over time. There's no stochasticity in agricultural profits in this model. If they enroll in the conservation program, they receive both their agricultural profit and an additional conservation incentive C. And of course, if they choose to develop, they receive the offer from the developer and they receive no more returns since the game is over for them. To address this question of spatial spillovers and to be able to solve the MDP model simultaneously for all agricultural parcels in the county, I utilize this parameter that I'm calling dev. So dev is a parameter between 0 and 1 inclusive that represents the area weighted probability that all neighboring parcels of parcel I have developed on or before the current time step t. So it's the area weighted probability that all of your neighboring parcels have developed. The higher your dev t parameter, the lower your agricultural profits. So you have your lowest possible agricultural profits if all of your neighbors have developed, and you have your highest possible agricultural profits if none of your neighbors have developed. And we assume that your neighboring parcel choices of when to develop are completely exogenous to you, but obviously their choices affect you and your choices affect them. So that's why we have to solve for all parcels simultaneously. How I end up doing that in practice is positing an initial belief of every landowner about what their neighboring parcels will do. My initial guess is 0 for all time steps, assuming none of your neighboring parcels will develop at all throughout the time series. And then we run the MDP model over all the parcels in the county. And then we update that belief based on the solution to the initial run of the MDP model. And we keep iterating over that belief until the landowner's belief about their neighbor's development choice reflects their optimal choice.
Emily?
Yeah.
Can you talk about your reasoning for why, as a farmer, my agricultural profit falls as my neighbors develop? So what's the real world intuition for why that might happen?
Yeah, I talked about this really quickly, but the idea is that if you have increasing residential development around your agricultural operation, it's a much higher likelihood that you're going to have noise complaints, smell complaints. You might have the county implement restrictions on those kinds of disturbances that might make your operations more costly. You could have increasing residential traffic on agricultural roads that can make it difficult to have tractors, other heavy machinery operating on those roads at the same time. And there could be increasing political pressure on types of allowable uses in these increasingly residential areas that add to the annoyance and real cost of having an agricultural operation. So in my model, I'm currently assuming a 10% reduction in agricultural profits if all of your neighboring parcels are developed. Okay, now I'm going to move on to talk about my results from these two models. Feel free to interrupt me with questions as we go.
Well, I will, if that's
Yep.
okay, before we do
Yep,
the
yep.
results. How big is the conservation incentive relative to either profits or farm revenue or the median conservation incentive per landowner in the county?
Yeah.
Is it big enough to matter, really?
I'll show the results for a couple different levels of incentives.
Okay.
So I test a lot of different incentive levels, but the primary ones are 25% of your agricultural profit, 50%, and 75%. I also have tested other ones. So I'm specifying the incentives as meaningful proportions of your overall agricultural profits, which ultimately aren't tremendous anyway, but so trying to specify the conservation incentives as meaningful. Okay. Okay, so here's some results. So for my business as usual scenario, so this is the results from the Markov decision process model without any option to participate in a conservation program. I find that, first of all, the parcels, agricultural parcels at highest risk of conversion to developed use are heavily concentrated around the developed areas. In the north, around the kind of Silicon Valley region, we have increasing risk of development in that fringe up here, indicated by the darker red parcels over time. And also in the south, where we have cities like Gilroy and Morgan Hill are also developing quickly. We also have hotspots of development of agricultural parcels over time there as well.
So
Yeah.
what would you expect is driving that? It seems like one piece is if my agricultural profits fall as areas around me develop, that could contribute to this because my agricultural profits fall. On the demand side of that price model, is there something in your price model that also picks up distance to existing development?
Yeah, well, it picks up distance to roads and distance to city centers. So those are hedonic variables that we're accounting for and predicting the price that developers are willing to offer.
And those have the signs that you would expect and are statistically significant?
Some of them are statistically significant, some are not. So there's a lot of different variables in there. Because it's a predictive model, I'm less worried about the significance of the coefficients, but yeah, that's right. They're generally the sign that I would expect. Okay. And so from a probability weighted perspective, so just multiplying the area of each parcel by the probability that they will have developed in each time step, I find that 1% of these agricultural parcels are going to have developed by 2030, 4% by 2040, and 11% in 2050. So this is under our business as usual scenario. So I can also compare my business as usual case with some independent analysis. So the Greenbelt Alliance is an NGO that works in the San Francisco Bay Area. They've also done an assessment of agricultural and open space land at risk of development. And they have these 3 different risk categories that they use: high risk areas, medium risk, and low risk. So they define high risk as parcels that are likely to be developed in the next 10 years, medium risk is likely to be developed in the next 30 years, and low risk is unlikely to be developed in the next 30 years. And so I'm showing here that these are the number of acres in Santa Clara County that fall into each of these risk categories as defined by the Greenbelt Alliance. This is using their maps of where the high risk and medium risk and low risk areas are. So just using their maps of these risk categories, these are the number of acres in Santa Clara County for each risk category. And then for my results, I show that they're generally aligned with how the Greenbelt Alliance is thinking about these risk categories. So in 2030, I find that the high risk category has 8% of agricultural land being developed and much lower percentages for the lower risk categories. By 2050, I find 39% of these high risk parcels are likely to be developed as opposed to 8.5% of the low risk area. So in general, my Mdp model is generating results that are consistent with other analysis in the region.
Emily, is one parcel 1 acre?
No, one parcel is an area of land owned by a single person.
Okay.
It's a legal unit.
If I owned 100 acres
Uh-huh.
and developed 1 acre of land,
Yeah.
you would observe one parcel of development, and which is 1 acre, and one parcel of non-development, which is 99 acres.
If you had a 100-acre parcel And in 2050, I said you had a 50% chance of having developed by then, I would say 50 acres have developed.
Yeah, thanks.
That's what, yeah, exactly. That's what I mean by probability weighted area of development. Okay, now let's look at what happens when we introduce the conservation program. And we'll start by looking at the decisions of a single parcel. So here I'm showing results for a single parcel across 5 different possible contract lengths for the conservation program and 6 different possible incentive levels. And so like we were discussing before, the incentive, I'm just defining them here as percentage of agricultural profit. Ranges from 0, so no incentive, all the way to 100, so doubling your agricultural profit. So my model is operating in 2-year time steps. So the 2-year contract length is the most flexible conservation program we can model in my model right now. So what we have for this flexible, the lowest possible contract length, it makes sense for this parcel owner to enroll in every time step as long as they're not developed, which means they've already exited the game. As long as they haven't developed, they're going to keep enrolling because the conservation program is not putting any constraint on when the parcel can be sold. So for this 2-year contract, we see the probability of the landowner enrolling in the conservation program steadily marching down over time, because in any time step, there's some probability that the developer offers the landowner its P star. That is when the developer, that's when the parcel will be sold to the developer. If the landowner doesn't end up in that state of the world, they'll just re-enroll in the program. We can see over time enrollment probability decreases because it's increasingly likely that the developer has offered the landowner its P star at some time in the past. The behavior of the landowner gets increasingly complicated as we lengthen the contract of the conservation program. So if we look at the 4-year contract, that means that let's, for example, look at the 100% incentive level. It definitely makes sense for the landowner to enroll in the initial time step because that incentive level for the conservation program is very high. So they have a 100% chance of enrolling in the first time step. After 4 years, the landowner can choose to either re-enroll, or they could not re-enroll and wait and see what happens, or they could immediately sell to the developer if at that time step they've reached their P star. So those 3 possible outcomes start to create a very messy timeline for what happens next. So at the end of the 4 years, the probability that the landowner enrolls shoots downward because there's some probability that they're developing. And then if they don't develop and they wait, there's a recovery period of choosing to re-enroll after a few time steps. And again, if they have enrolled after 4 years, again, there's going to be another correction if they've reached their P star at the end of that contract. And so that correction every time you reach the end of your contract creates this sawtooth pattern in the behavior of an individual parcel. That sawtooth gets coarser as the length of the contract gets longer and longer. But it's a sawtooth pattern that you're going to see in the results going forward.
So Emma,
Yes.
from this picture here, what we really care about is whether these parcels develop or not.
Mhm.
We care about whether they're enrolled because that has something to do with whether they develop or not. I would expect that picture of development to sort of be the mirror
Yes.
of this, but maybe not perfectly.
Yeah, I have the figure of development. I should have a button to go to that. I have it in my appendix. It essentially looks like the mirror of this because there's some people who are waiting and then re-enrolling, but for the most part, if you're not enrolling, you've developed. So yeah, I focus more on just looking at probability of development. Okay, now that we kind of understand what's going on for a single parcel, we can look at the county as a whole. So this is showing the probability weighted area of development for each time step under the business as usual case. It's the highest level of land development. And then we have three different scenarios of contract lengths. We have a 2-year, a 4-year, and an 8-year contract, all at a $200 per acre incentive level. And so we can see that across these different contract lengths for the same incentive level, you don't achieve too much variation in the amount of avoided development. So these lines are approximately 25 to 30% lower in the amount of development across time compared to the business as usual scenario. So you are avoiding some, a good amount of that agricultural land conversion. The changes in contract length don't appear to do too much in the amount of avoided development, in changing the amount of avoided development. But what happens is that the longer contract lengths require fewer parcels enrolled to achieve that same amount of avoided development, because when you're utilizing just the 2-year contract or the most flexible program design, you're only employing that subsidy effect that we talked about, whereas the 4-year and the 8-year contract lengths are pulling in that shield effect that is contributing additional avoided development in addition to the subsidy effect. And then we can see that for that reason, per acre of avoided development, the costs under the 4-year and the 8-year contracts are lower, much lower in the near term than the 2-year contract. Over time, those costs decrease because you're accumulating avoided development over time. But the 2-year contract continues to be the most costly.
So that's a cool result, but I'm still trying to piece out why, like how that happens. Because this is really a long run result,
Yes,
right?
right.
Like you just showed that previous figure over many decades.
Yep.
And across all of these that are being compared, the annual subsidy is held the same.
Yes,
Right.
right.
You get $200 per acre per year or something like that.
$200 per acre per year. Yep.
So their sort of long run expectation of what they're gonna, or what their knowledge of what they're gonna earn.
Right.
By enrolling.
Yep.
That's the same, and the only thing that differs is the commitment length.
That's right.
So I guess I'm just trying to figure out why, like, how do you get less participation with the longer contracts, but maintain the same amount of plots conserved?
Right. Well, it's
And
not plots, it's acres.
Or acres
Right.
conserved, and maybe the answer is you're sort of impacting fewer acres because you have the longer contract length, but fewer acres enrolled. So you're impacting fewer acres because fewer acres are enrolled, but you're having a stronger impact on acres that are enrolled because of the shield effect.
I'm not 100% sure I followed that line of reasoning. My, maybe I'll say my explanation, and we can meet in the middle. So I explained it. So your cumulative probability of development is what we care about here. When you're employing the shield effect, you're reducing the probability of development while you're enrolled. So that's just like lagging your probability of development in the results. So you require fewer acres enrolled because the acres that are enrolled have that much lower probability of development over time. Because the more flexible the contract, the more opportunity you have to develop those enrolled acres at greater intervals.
Yeah, I
Does
think
that
we're saying
help?
the same thing.
Okay.
I think just the curious thing is, under the longer contract length.
Yeah.
You have fewer acres enrolled, but those acres are more strongly protected.
Exactly.
And it's just sort of curious that those end up kind of washing out, right?
Yeah, I find that interesting
Yeah.
too,
So
for a given incentive level. So that's for, sorry, so I only have a couple more slides here.
Sure.
That's right. So right here, we're only looking at the effect of changing contract length, not incentive level. So when we change incentive level, we can also see some interesting results. So this figure is showing the amount of the per acre per year conservation incentive on the y-axis and the amount of development avoided achieved by 2040. So just one kind of analytical year on the x-axis across 3 different contract lengths. So these are kind of the supply curves of avoided development for 3 different contract lengths. And so here we can start to look at, for a given county budget, what type of program design makes the most sense for them. So not all of this information is shown in this exact figure, but I'll just try to tell the story here. So for a conservation incentive of $100 per acre per year, across these 3 possible contract lengths, the cost to the county is about $10 million per year across all enrolled acres. So if the county had $10 million, I would say you could implement a $100 per acre per year and be fully subscribed. If you wanted to maximize the amount of avoided development you could achieve at that incentive level, you would implement a 4-year contract. Just based on the information, we would have to test more incentive levels and contract lengths to be more specific about what exactly would maximize under that budget. But that's kind of what you can take away from this incentive, from this figure. If the county had a $20 million budget, I would say don't implement the $100 per year incentive level because you won't be fully subscribed. That's too low of an incentive to fully utilize the $20 million. And if you wanted to cost effectively maximize how many acres you preserve at that budget level, you would also implement the 4-year contract. So that's kind of, there's a lot of information kind of to combine in optimizing the program design here, but this kind of starts to show how you can use this model to do that. So to wrap up, I posit that I'm providing an interesting set of intuitive findings around how short-term voluntary conservation programs can help reduce agricultural conversion to developed use by both shielding parcels from conversion while they're enrolled and by subsidizing the agricultural use while they're enrolled. So we have these 2 useful effects ongoing under this voluntary program, but long-term market trends can still ultimately drive agricultural land conversion. So we could think about these short-term programs as one tool in the arsenal, possibly, to help preserve agricultural land use while other possibly more binding policies are put in place, like changes in zoning or urban growth boundaries, things like this. My model can be used for helping county decision makers. Given a budget and a set of objectives, we can define what levels of incentive and what contract lengths would help maximize the amount of avoided development in that region. And I think this model approach can really usefully be modified and applied to larger land sector climate policies and help fill a really important literature gap in this space by looking at the importance of landowner choice in participating in these kinds of voluntary programs. So I will stop there. Thank you all so much for listening, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.
I'm nervous I've missed something important, but how much avoided emissions happen, and what is the, and if you put it in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, what is the global social benefit of those 5,000 acres that have been avoided?
Right, so, and so this is a kind of a part of the analysis that really needs to be evaluated next, is kind of the benefits side of the analysis. How much greenhouse gas emissions can we actually avoid? So this particular analysis so far has focused entirely on the cost side. So how much will it cost to encourage landowners to enroll and achieve a given set of outcomes? So what I've done as a first blush at getting at the benefits side is I've assumed that, let's just assume that every acre that we've conserved was an almond orchard. If we had converted all of that land to developed use and lost all of that biomass in the almond orchard, then assuming the cost of enrollment that I developed, we would have conserved carbon at the price of roughly $160 to $230 per ton of CO2. So I need to get more granular on what exactly are we achieving in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And that comes, as we talked about, from the biomass and topsoil loss, as well as avoided vehicle miles traveled and other residential sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So that is really where this type of analysis needs to focus next.
Thanks.
Any Zoom question?
But
I don't see anything on chat so far.
Yeah, I got a quick question for you, Emily.
yes,
First of all, super cool presentation, super interesting.
thank you.
You talked a little bit about having doing some sensitivity analyses.
TJ, I don't know if anyone else is having a hard time hearing TJ or if it's just us. in the
I'll just type it.
room. Sorry.
So while TJ types it out, I did have a question, but I think I also got the answer. Could we step back? And I think you had given us the answer. I'm just trying to make sure I get it right. So
Bring it.
this slide says that for avoided development, the contract length doesn't matter, at least amongst the set considered here.
Mhm.
But then when you go to the next slide, when you go to, actually one more maybe, where you say, here, you say the preferred contract length appears to be 4 years, at least within this set considered.
Mhm, mhm.
So we go from a story where contract length doesn't matter, but to one where it does matter. And I think the reason for that is on the previous slide, it doesn't matter, but in terms of acres conserved, but it does matter in how much money the county is
Exactly.
spending.
Exactly.
And this slide takes into account how much money the county is spending.
Exactly. Exactly. The first slide looked only at that avoided development outcome and didn't look at the costs at all. And here we are actually starting to plot out that supply curve for a given contract length and a given incentive level.
Cool.
Did I get anything?
Here's TJ's question. Do you see it?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
How sensitive are your results to the volatility of the land price offers? They're very sensitive. So, so like the land price volatility is the kind of core structure of the Markov decision process model. So maybe you're asking if we increase the volatility in those developer offers, you know, what happens? So it depends on a lot of things, but holding everything else constant, in general, if you increase the volatility of that stochastic process, you're going to front load you're going to increase the cost of waiting. It depends on kind of the trend of the stochastic process over time, but increasing volatility in general will shorten the optimal time to wait. I don't know if that answers TJ's question. Yes, great. Cool. Any other questions from folks? I also very much welcome, you know, reactions afterwards or emails. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen today, and especially for like the hour plus length. Yeah, let me know. Welcome any and all feedback. Brutally honest reactions, things you were confused by, definitely welcome feedback on that. Okay, I think we're good. Thanks, everybody. We'll log off now.
When is your presentation?
When's next